Hey y'all, this is State Representative Erin Zwiener. I'm a Texas State Representative representing District 45, Hayes and Blanco counties, just southwest of the Austin area. Thank you for joining us tonight for this special webinar on Freedom Summer. We're really excited that y'all are joining us, and I'm really grateful to have these fantastic panelists with us tonight to really talk about why the freedom to read and engage with different materials is so critical for Texans. We're going to be talking about it with a lens on the LGBTQIA+ community, but it's something that's important across a number of axes. And it's something I'm particularly passionate about because of my background in creative writing and children's books. And it's so important that our kids both have access to books that can serve as mirrors, where they can see people who are like them reflected on the page. But it's also really important that our children and our youth have access to books that can serve as windows and give them access to the experiences of people who are different than them. Fiction is an incredible way that we develop empathy for others, as well as are affirmed in who we are. So really grateful to have folks joining us tonight. This is a project of the Texas House LGBTQ Caucus. We were formed in January 2019 to create a forum for Texas legislatures, for the Texas legislators to discuss issues that affect LGBTQ Texans and to further the goal of equality and justice for all. The election of 5 openly LGBTQ women created the catalyst for the Texas House LGBTQ Caucus. Now we are up to 6 out members of the Texas House, and we are anticipating that number being as high as 8 LGBTQ members next session. The House LGBTQ Caucus exists to create awareness and advocate for LGBTQ Texans while employing an intersectional lens in our march towards social equity and justice. So I would like to introduce our panelists today. We're going to start with Marti Bier, the Director of Programs at Texas Freedom Network.
Thanks, Representative. My name is Marti Bier. I'm the Director of Programs at the Texas Freedom Network, as you said. I use they, them pronouns. We are a nonpartisan, multi-issue grassroots organization that is building an informed and effective movement toward equality and social justice. So we have been working on LGBTQ equality issues over the past 27 years, but we also are very involved and engaged in education issues and have most recently been working a lot on educational censorship. So that is why we're here. A little bit more about me. I am a parent of 2 public school kids. I've been working in LGBTQ work, for the last probably 20 something years. I'm very excited to be here. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for joining us. Next up, we have Christine Emeran, the Director of the Youth Free Expression Program at the National Coalition Against Censorship.
Thank you, Representative Zwiener. I'm pleased to be here tonight. And as she stated, I am the Director of the Youth Free Expression Program at the National Coalition Against Censorship. It's a nonpartisan alliance of over 50 national nonprofits that includes the umbrella of literary as well as artistic, religious, educational, professional, labor, and civil liberty groups. Next year will mark our 50th year. So we've been around supporting those that are under fire for over 50 years. So it's wonderful to be here tonight. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Emeran. And next we have Carolyn Foote, who uses she, her pronouns, a veteran librarian, retired Rewired librarian consultant, and an advocate and a co-founder of Freedom Fighters. And I have to make a special note, Carolyn Foote is actually my former high school librarian.
Well, it's amazing to see you working on these issues now. Yes, it's very gratifying. I am Carolyn Foote. I am one of the co-founders of a grassroots movement with 3 other librarians of a group called the Freedom Fighters. That's FREADOM Fighters, who are acting in support of teachers, librarians, students, and authors in this heated moment in time in libraries. And I'm a 29-year librarian who is Rewired. I recently retired, and I was an English teacher for 10 years prior to that. So, of course, reading and literacy are near and dear to my heart. And I'm pleased to be able to join you today.
Thank you so much. Next up, Kyle Lukoff, he, him, author, experienced bookseller and librarian, and writer of a banned book, Call Me Max.
Hi, everyone. I am the writer of a handful of banned books, and that number just keeps growing. Before that, I spent 8 years as an elementary school librarian, working every day with students working every day with kids who are 2-year-olds up through 5th graders. I made the switch to write full-time in 2020, and some of my titles include Too Bright to See, which won a Stonewall Award and a National Book Award finalist. And I'm the first trans person to get a Newbery honor, which was cool. My most recent book is also my first nonfiction. It's called If You're a Kid Like Gavin, which I co-wrote with a young trans activist named Gavin Grimm. And it chronicles how he partnered with the ACLU to sue his school over bathroom access. And a book that I am fairly well known for in the great state of Texas is Call Me Max, which has been banned in lots and lots and lots and lots of schools and libraries all over the country. And I think I'll be talking a little bit more about this book later on in the program.
Thank you. And last but not least, Avatara Smith-Carrington, they, them.
Thank you, Representative. My name is Avatara Smith-Carrington. I use they, them pronouns. I am a staff attorney at Lambda Legal, based out of the Dallas office. Lambda Legal is the nation's largest and oldest organization dedicated to achieving full civil rights for LGBTQ people and all people living with HIV. So it's just a pleasure to be a part of this amazing panel. I'm also a fan of banned books. I have some of my fondest memories of reading the books that, as you kind of get to know the history of certain authors, you start to realize that they were previously banned. So again, Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison and so many others. So I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Avatara, and I'm sorry you were the name of the group I found a way to mess up. My apologies. So I'm really glad we have this great community of folks with us today. You know, all over the US, we've really seen an alarming rise in attempts at educational censorship, book challenges, and book banning. In an April 22 report from PEN America, Texas led the nation with the most documented book bans for any state in the US. This followed calls from certain lawmakers to investigate and remove hundreds of books from Texas schools, the majority of which represented the lived experience of LGBTQIA+ folks and people of color. Now more than ever, it's critical that we come together and chart a path forward to protect the First Amendment and ensure that all students have access to an accurate, honest, and quality education, an education that is reflective of the diverse communities across our state and the country. As summer comes to a close and students return to school, Freedom Summer brings together legislators, librarians, educators, advocates, and legal experts to share their insights on this issue and offer tangible steps you can take to fight censorship. But we see these attacks ongoing. Just in the last day, we've seen a school district in North Texas, Keller ISD, informing teachers and librarians to remove all previously challenged books from school shelves. Even the books that passed the challenged committees that empowered people in school districts and those community members to review the books that passed those reviews still are being removed from shelves. This includes the Diary of Anne Frank graphic novel even. So things like that are unfortunate, and why action is so critical right now. So we're going to start out with me asking the panelists some questions, but I want anyone who's participating to know you can use the Q&A function of Zoom to put your own questions to the panel, and we will ask those after we've gone through a couple questions that we have pre-prepared. So just use that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to post any questions. So first, I have a question for Kyle. Your children's book, Call Me Max, has been one book targeted in a series of attacks on LGBTQIA+ stories in schools across the country. Last year it was banned from Eanes ISD in Texas after it was read aloud in a 4th grade classroom. The district's response categorized the book's content as, quote, sensitive material and cited the need for prior parental approval awareness. Can you tell us a little bit about Call Me Max and share your response to the criticism and treatment of the book in schools?
I sure can. I actually wonder, would it be all right with you if I read aloud from a letter that I wrote to a district representative around when all that happened last winter?
Absolutely.
I would say that I could just sort of like fumble through repeating what I've said before, but I'm very pleased with how that letter turned out. So I'd like to read that if that is okay with everyone. So I said, I read with interest the letter you recently sent to families copied below regarding a teacher who chose to read a book I wrote, Call Me Max, to a 4th grade classroom. Call Me Max, which is this one, for those of you who forget, is an early reader written intentionally to be accessible for early readers, typically children around 1st and 2nd grade. It tells the story of Max, a young transgender boy, and how he came to learn about himself and share that with his friends and family. It is generally regarded as a sweet, gentle introduction to the subject of transgender identities and gender stereotypes based on my experience as both a transgender man and an elementary school librarian. You describe it as a book containing sensitive material about a, quote, young person explaining the topic of gender identity, end quote. You use the phrase gender identity 3 times in this letter, in fact, when the book is more specifically about a transgender boy. I'm curious, why did you not use the word transgender in this letter? How do you feel about that word? How do you feel about transgender people? Did you know that most people, yourself included, I assume, have a gender identity? When you hear the word transgender, what comes to your mind? If you read the book Call Me Max, did that story teach you anything? If you didn't read Call Me Max, why not? I was also fascinated to read the part where you explained that, quote, as soon as this occurrence came to the attention of the principal, he immediately contacted the district office. Counselors were made available to support students, and the school administration worked with families to provide an explanation and reassurances, end quote. I spent 8 years as an elementary school librarian, and I'm familiar with the situations where so many resources are expanded to ensure the well-being of students and families. After the Sandy Hook shooting, for example, or after a death in the school or some other crisis. Do you believe that a read aloud about a transgender child is an equivalent to trauma? How do you think transgender people in your community felt having their identities treated like a disaster? Do you provide similar resources after a student in your district experiences homophobia or transphobia? Do you provide similar support to students experiencing other forms of oppression like racism or ableism? Your letter says that, quote, we've always tried to create a climate where all children feel they belong, end quote. How do you think transgender people in your community will feel after reading this letter? Do you think this would encourage talented transgender educators to apply for positions in your schools? Do you think that all children, all people can feel they belong in a community where books about them are met with such disavowal? What are you doing to ensure that the needs of all people in your community are being met, aside from putting that sentence in a letter, the entirety of which indicates the opposite? And that's where I stopped. That letter I tried to write in assuming a good faith intention, assuming that many answers to that question would actually be, oh, like, I guess I don't know much about trans people. I guess I am curious to learn more. But of course, over the last 18 months, we've seen that there are no, in fact, good faith investigations of these things, and that answer to those questions are that, yes, the existence of transgender people is a direct threat to the well-being of children, and the threat in the form of those people and literature about them should be removed expediently. I would write a different letter today.
It's become harder and harder to presume good faith as these conversations have continued. And I think certainly a pattern we see is LGBTQ or books about LGBTQIA+ issues being rounded up to be explicit, even when they're not. And in this case, being called sensitive when it's just telling someone's story. So I want to ask all the panelists to share, when LGBTQIA+ and the stories of Black and Indigenous people of color are challenged or banned in schools and public libraries, these attacks are rarely about the individual book in question. What insights can you offer on the motivations behind the recent rise in book challenges and book banning? What's contributing to these rising numbers of book challenges and censorship attempts?
I'll weigh in if that's okay. As a librarian, I think that there's numerous factors contributing, but as you can hear from what Kyle read, the harm to students is that they feel like they do not belong in the school at all if books about their lives are being removed from the shelves, nor do their families feel like they belong. So that is the real harm. The factors that I think are contributing to it are numerous. Parents at home had more input during COVID into their child's education, or more of a window into their child's education over Zoom. And I think that created a certain environment to begin with. I think that, having to send their child back to physical school and relinquish that control is a factor. But I also think it's just that our society has become more and more pluralistic and accepting. Our publishing industry has recognized more and more authors telling their own stories. And there's been a real movement, like we need diverse books to bring a wider diversity of authors into children's and young adult literature. And I think some people find that threatening. And I think finally there's been a political effort after the Virginia governor won his governor's race over the discussion of a book, Beloved, by Toni Morrison. Suddenly everyone saw that as an opportunity to use books and libraries as a lever in electoral politics. And it's created a very challenging environment, all of those things put together.
I'll go next. So I'm like coming into this like present moment with thinking about like there's really truly nothing new under the sun. And so much of this is kind of an amplification of what has already happened in the past, and we're seeing it happen at almost an accelerated rate. And because of the fact that I think that we're finding that there are more there's more diversity in terms of what's available to students. So, I mentioned earlier on, my mom's a teacher, an English teacher. And so I used to tell people all the time that when I was growing up, I had this amazing chance to just go through her library at home, and I would just pull these books. And the funny thing about it was I was never able to find those books in my school library. And I always used to wonder why. And like, I grew up and recognized that like most of the time those books were just not there, because books that actually reflected my own lived reality, or the lived reality of so many of my friends who were Black and brown and who also held other identities, were often not present. And so now we're in this moment where, students have the ability to access these materials in their schools, and instead of being presented with the opportunity to just indulge and kind of run free in their schools, we're seeing kind of a backlash. And so much of that backlash is honestly more so hitting at people and not really the literature. It's hitting at like, what's the source of, like, LGBTQ people, and then more specifically like trans people, right? And so I think that in this moment, the one thing I keep on coming back to is just seeing that, of course, it's also connected to parents being possibly more engaged with understanding what their students are reading, or what their kids are reading. But I think the other part is just that this is a very much so political space, and like we are seeing essentially an acknowledgement of the fact that when you present anyone, but especially students, with the ability to see themselves in literature, you're giving them an opportunity to actually fully be who they are in those spaces. And it's almost kind of like a, God forbid these kids actually have the ability to see themselves in this space. And I think that is the part that hurts the most, because we're actually recognizing that in a moment where students should be able to have access to this information, we're seeing these books being removed, and to the point where it will look interesting this school year and school years to come, if those books are not placed back on the shelves. Because what are students going to be forced to do but to hope that those materials are made available elsewhere?
I'd like to add to what the panelists before have said. And two trends that we've been noticing, over the past year or so, is that there are actually two things that are remarkable, and it builds a little bit on what we've been talking about before. Is the first one I want to talk about is about the content restrictive legislation that we've been seeing, and the legislation that has come out in the last year or so is aimed to restrict the access to information as well as teaching about racial and sexual identities. And they use the guise of parental rights. And these laws that we've seen are attempts to curb teaching of so-called divisive concepts. And they also restrict information that relates to gender, sexuality, racial diversity. And as we've been talking about, Florida and Texas are one of the most high profile jurisdictions to pass new laws in this particular domain. And a second thing to note that also builds on this conversation is that what we've seen in terms of a trend is mass book bans. And what I mean by that is that there's been organization, like organized opposition to large list of books. And generally, when you look at the subject matter of these types of books, they relate to LGBTQ+, anti-racism, or some type of racial diversity theme. And the goal of this type of opposition, usually PACs are kind of evolved, is the goal is to remove these types of books from curriculums as well as school libraries. And so what we've been seeing is that these campaigns offer a type of public pressure that lead these educational institutions to censorship. Sometimes it's preemptive censorship in terms of a chilling effect. According to, like, we've seen teachers cited in the news reports talking about this in terms of being fearful in terms of how to select curriculum or library resources. And some of the environments that we've been following happen to be in Texas and Florida. In terms of looking at this type of PAC, pressure in terms of its, chilling effects. And most recently, as it's been mentioned, it has been in Texas, but we've also seen cases in Georgia, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, and so forth.
I just want to add one thing that hasn't been mentioned yet, because all of you said everything I would have said, but there's also kind of the not so secret goal of the far right trying to dismantle public education in Texas. And, I think this is such a opportunistic opportunity to be able to cast doubt in our teachers, in our educators, in our librarians, in the systems that many of us trust in, right? But this is such an easy way that they have found, to be able to cast that doubt. And so that is something that it's become such a wedge issue politically, because they're looking for, I've got a cat that just really wants to be part of this conversation. They're looking for whatever wedge issues we can find. And this one happens to be like du jour, the thing that everybody's jumping onto.
And I want to add to that point that we're seeing particularly lots of cases in suburban districts. And that interest in the suburban vote, I think, cannot be disregarded as part of this whole climate right now.
Yeah, thank you all for that. I know one thing we've also been seeing is harassment of educators who try to have inclusive material in their classrooms. And I think that's a big factor as well for pushing some of that preemptive censorship, as educators are afraid of being targeted on social media by parents, or sometimes even not parents who live in their school district. I want to remind folks you can put questions in the Q&A. I see we've got a couple of questions coming in. I want to make sure everyone knows they can do that. So, there's this critical importance of young people seeing themselves represented in literature, history, school curriculum, and all forms of media. What do y'all feel are the long-term effects of the loss of so many books that tell diverse stories? And then in addition, with educational censorship, what is the impact on our students and on our society. Don't everyone unmute all at once.
So I think, so it's an interesting question, right? So you're asking, what are the long-term effects of these kinds of stories not being available for children? And, you know, like something that Avatara said earlier is also similar to my experience. Like you were saying that you saw books in your parents' library that you didn't get to see in school. I mean, there weren't books about trans kids until, you know, 3, 5, 7 years ago. There was one that I can think of, but that one doesn't count. So, and like there weren't there were very, very, very few books about any kind of queer people, and the very few that existed were always about like very specifically like white, usually upper class, like cis lesbians or cis gay men, you know, the tiniest of handfuls. And yet like there's still lots of gay people. There's still lots of trans people. So you're not going to stop queer and trans people from existing. Like kids are still going to be who they are, regardless of whether or not they have books, which is why I think that it's so important to keep focusing on what everyone is bringing back up earlier, that it's not, that like talking about representation can be important, especially from like a craft and writer's perspective, but that we can't lose focus on the attempts to dismantle the public education system and using, you know, the disenfranchisement of children as like a cover for parental rights. And we also can't ignore the ways that like moral panics have always or almost always focused on children as like a vulnerable, disenfranchised group of human beings who are not seen as like valued or entitled members of society. So like if kids don't get to read my books, they're still going to be who they are. But the question is what kind of world and what kind of political climate and what kind of social system will they be queer and trans people in? And it might be much worse than where we are today.
I want to tag on to what you said in that regard, because I think often one of the things that got me and our team at Freedom Fighters to create the cause that we have in the grassroots organization was our care for students, because we see them being used as political pawns, really. And yet the impact on them, and from talking to students, I know this, is that it sends a message that they aren't okay, that they don't belong, they don't have a place on the shelf in our libraries or our classrooms. They're something that requires a permission slip. So imagine you're a young person trying to figure out who you are, which all young people are, and you're getting messages that who you think you are requires a permission slip or a restricted shelf in one part of the library. And these tropes are being pulled out, of course, the sort of stale old LGBTQ tropes about, you know, grooming and so on and so forth, that I had hoped our society had moved past, and clearly, you know, we have not. But again, that causes these students to feel like, you know, there's something wrong with them. And I feel that imposes great harm. And also we forget in all these conversations, I feel like we are also forgetting about the students who are heterosexual, but their parents are gay, the parents who have adopted them or who had them. And so what message are those kids getting about their families when laws like Florida's Don't Say Gay pass and you can't discuss these topics? It tells them their whole family isn't okay. And so I feel like these are very harmful things for our kids' psyches.
I just want to reflect, you know, definitely it's so important for kids to see themselves reflected and to see somebody with their voice or face, you know, be expressed in material. And I also just want to kind of address one of the issues that people do have is like, oh, if my kid gets this material in the library and I didn't want to talk to them about it, or I didn't think it was appropriate that they found this at their school or that their teacher talked about it. I mean, I have a middle schooler and a elementary schooler, and the kids will get this information from their peers, from the internet, from all kinds of other places that actually places like the library or their teachers are a better source of information than another 11-year-old. So, I want to make sure that another piece of this is that having factual or even fictional representations of, media and materials that are in libraries and in schools is actually a much better source of information for a lot of kids.
Or better than the internet.
Definitely better than the internet.
Agreed. I want to build a little bit on, what Carolyn and Marti have said. And oftentimes we see that these topics that these books covers are difficult. And sometimes it becomes the source of, these objections to these particular books because of their violence or perhaps a traumatic history, or it might be about religion or sexuality. But we have to also keep in mind that these topics might be difficult, but they are important to lives of students and also can be addressed with sensitivity within a classroom space under the guidance of educators that are trained to do that. So we have to also keep in mind that, they're very well, prepared to have these types of discussions. We want to keep that in mind. And also, I think there's something else to think about in terms of like the student is that, these books that we see that are targeted, depict identity and stories that, as we've been saying, have only been recently available, like on library shelves in schools. And so really what we're seeing is this campaign to remove them is like a threat to those gains, to offer more diverse curricula that's representative to a growing diverse student body. So I think that's something also to keep in mind. But also in general, we have to keep in mind that not everyone will ever like, every book in a library or a classroom. And also parents can object to books, and they do have a right to decide what their own children read. But the school administrators have the responsibility to uphold the freedom of the students to read and cannot limit the educational materials that are provided and approved by a specific individual or group. So for us, when we think about book banning, it does raise concern, not only that the students might have limited access to explore like a vast body of literature, but also that these campaigns to remove books can also have negative effects on when we think about youth free expression. Because for us, we're looking at schooling, public schooling in particular, as a foundation of, where students learn how to be citizens and learn to interact in a society that's democratic and, open and inclusive. So these are the kind of the values that we want to transmit. And when we ban books, that kind of works against, this project of what schooling is all about.
Go ahead. I only had one thing to add to this. So the other thing that I really felt was important to also not get lost in this is that I keep on coming back to not only school libraries, but also public libraries, because I feel like, we've definitely been made aware of, not only the attack on school libraries and what does this mean for the public education systems, but I've also been seeing this concerted effort to bring down public libraries as well. And when I think about especially during the pandemic, what a wealth of resources can come out of a public library. It's just wow, this is I would hate to say this, but it's just such a strategic move. So there's that piece. And then the other part that I keep on coming back to, which is slightly an interesting analogy to make, maybe, I don't know, but it kind of keeps on bringing me back to a case that we litigated at Lambda Legal, which is a Diversity Center versus Trump, which had to do with Trump's executive order that was an attempt to ban essentially workplace discussions on race and sexuality, gender, the things that make workplaces better places for all people. And I'm only bringing that up because I look at okay, when you're looking at a library and you're thinking about how are people interacting with the materials that they're able to access, we're talking about, as folks have already flagged, this is how you actually create an informed group of people, the ability to actually access access literature, whether or not it's something that's important to you or it holds something that is, you know, pivotal to your identity, this, that, and the third. This is actually how you create a like robust society of people who understand each other, who are willing to engage in really like interesting ideas and discussions, even when they are the ones that cause tension. And I feel like every time we remove another book, we remove the opportunity to actually have these discussions. We remove the opportunity to actually correct and rectify issues that are not only in the past, but are showing up in the present. And it's because of the fact that we keep on running away from and like trying to erase the fact that it's still happening. And so I think that's just what I'm coming back to. It's just like, you know, I look at this process that's happening not only in our school libraries, but also in our public libraries. And I'm recognizing that, yes, it's a chilling effect in terms of curriculum and discussions and the possibility of like having engaging conversations, but also it's just like, and what does this actually mean for our society as a whole? Like, where are we going to be left? And I feel like it's kind of scary, to be honest.
I'm really grateful for y'all, you know, really discussing this from a democracy angle, because we don't just have public schools and public libraries because those are nice things. We have things like that because they're critical for the project of a pluralistic democracy, which I would hope is a value and believe is a value, you know, most Texans and Americans share, but we're definitely threatening that value right now. I also, on that issue, I keep thinking of a book by Texas author Benjamin Size, Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe. That was just this incredibly sweet book about two Mexican-American teenage boys in El Paso figuring out they love each other. And, you know, some of my personal stories, I came out as bisexual to one friend when I was 16 and didn't tell anyone else for a decade. And so much of that was because how bisexuality was portrayed at the time, very intensely fetishized. And I'm trying to think how my story might have been different if instead of having MTV music videos as my only reference for what bisexuality looked like, if I'd had a story like that. And so I think it's a real danger to kids to lose some of those bridges to see themselves reflected. I've got another question for you, Marti, in particular. You know, last year, Texas led the nation with the most book challenges and bans for any state. We also saw the critical race theory ban, and there's talks about pursuing a Florida-style "Don't Say Gay" bill in Texas. So we certainly anticipate another very active session around these issues. I know Texas Freedom Network launched the Teach to Truth Coalition to fight educational censorship. Can you talk about the work of the coalition and how Texans can get involved and support this critical work?
I would love to do that. Thank you for asking. So, you know, Texas Freedom Network, we've been on the forefront of countering far-right extremism and the politicians who legislated for over 27 years. So we've been around for a minute. And we've also been the watchdogs at the State Board of Education, you know, where we've been participating in their adoption of curriculum standards. There's social studies, science, like all the things that the far right has consistently tried to make up things to put in there. And, you know, obviously during the 2021 session, you noted some of the things that have happened, some of the things that we're projecting will probably happen. And like, none of this is new. It's been going on and over, just in different formats for a long time. So this year, we did launch the Teach the Truth campaign, and where we've brought together a coalition of folks and organizations around the state, and some are national organizations. What we believe is that students across Texas deserve an accurate, honest, and quality education that allows them to see themselves represented, to access truthful information, and to learn from our past in order to build a better future for themselves and their country. So it's a three-pronged campaign. We are working on the State Board of Education, so we train and bring folks out to testify when the State Board is hearing the social studies standards this year, but you know, next year it'll be a different set of standards. They do it kind of cyclically. So we're doing that right now. We also are working to grow local grassroots work in local school board areas. As we mentioned earlier, obviously a lot of this has been focused at the very local level. I think part of that's because the school, like running for school board for for some folks is just kind of is like low hanging fruit. It's like there's so few people that vote in those elections, unfortunately, that like that's where people get their foot getting started in being in politics. It's also where the far right has, for a long period of time, invested a lot of resources into building this campaign, into getting folks into school boards. And so we are now seeing the effects of that, unfortunately. So we are, what we're doing is trying to work on, we work in school board elections. We are working, like I said, we're working with local advocates to go to their school boards to respond when book bans are coming up and when censorship situations are coming up. So we, the best way we would love to have more and more people involved. Anybody who's on this call, if you're interested in getting involved with the campaign or organizing in your local community, if you want to learn more about testifying at the State Board of Education with us, I don't know if I have access to post links, but I can post a link of our webpage where you can sign up to get more information, like I said, about organizing in your local community. If you want us to come and present to a local group or work with you personally to figure out how you can plug in, we are building a statewide, group of folks who are all engaged in these issues. We have hundreds of folks that have signed up since the beginning of the year, and that was, that was after we'd already had lots of other people involved with our organization for lots and lots of time. So it's really exciting. We have a lot of people interested, and if I can figure out how to post in here, I will, and send y'all information how to sign up. We have I'll just let you know, we have our next training is next Tuesday, August 23rd from 6:30 to 7:30. I can also post the link to sign up for that training.
Thank you, Marti. I am as ignorant about the technical specifications as you are, but I'm sure at the very least we can get people a follow-up email with some of that info if Chesley can't get it in the chat. And quick shout out to the staff who are making this possible. Chesley with the Caucus and Miguel with my office have been doing a lot of work to make this happen. Marti, a little bit of a follow-up question from Representative Donna Howard, actually, who's apparently tuning in. Have y'all thought about any proactive positive legislation to help sort of affirm good processes and provide protections for students in schools as opposed to just plain defense?
Oh, Representative Howard, I wish I'd known this question was coming. Let me chew on that for a minute, but absolutely, we would love to work with, if we think of something, and I'm not our political director, so there may be something already cooking. I would love to work with y'all, obviously, on any proactive legislation. It's so often that we're just playing defense on so many of these issues that I would love to be able to play offense and have something good come out of this. So the answer is yes, but hold for that.
Thanks, Marti. The next question I have is for Avatara. So these attacks on the freedom of expression and the right to read not only endanger students and Texans' quality of education, they also violate the Constitution. Can you speak more about some of the legal ramifications?
Yeah, so, with book removals, especially targeted book removals like we've been seeing, there are definitely constitutional implications, and more specifically First Amendment violations that are potentially at play. And so there's like some Supreme Court precedent that you can look at. One of the cases that come to mind would be like Island Trees v. Pico, which is a case that oftentimes folks, that's kind of like an interesting case to look at in this time. But what I would say is this, because I've actually been thinking, and this is actually coming off of the heels of the discussion that was just happening. By the time that we get to litigation, sometimes that is in a defensive posture. And oftentimes I'm wondering, like, what can be done proactively so that way we don't have to get to that point? Because I'm a fan of, if a book does not have to be removed from a library, that's a positive. Like, if we can actually, make sure that we're in a position where, honestly, I'm seeing more books go on the shelves, that's even better. And so, I've been thinking about this, and the one thing I keep on coming back to is, Marti, you had a really good point about, there are so many ways for people to get involved, specifically at the school board level, and like thinking about like, well, what's happening in your district? And I've been kind of following how things are unfolding in Texas across different districts in terms of, how book removals are happening, the different process, the different ways that the process can unfold. And the one thing I keep on thinking about is just, honestly, there was this really ingenious thing that I saw, and I thought it was funny, but I think it's really serious when you think about it. I was looking at an article today that a colleague sent to me, and one of the books that got removed was the Bible. And I looked at the reason for the removal, and I honestly cackled. Like, I was just like, oh, okay. And it was kind of like a two can play at that game situation. Now, I don't think, right, like that's always going to be the easiest way to do this, because honestly, at that point when I was looking at that, I was just like, at this point, we're going to have no books on the shelves. But I say that to say that there is a way that I feel communities can come together to really be strategic in how this is happening in their school districts. When you're seeing that books are being removed, the one thing I want to like strongly encourage people to do is to not just wait and sit by and allow for those books to be removed, but to see how you can plug in and also like stay on top of the process. Another thing that happens is like when something's not transparent, that's how books get lost. And so when people are actually staying on top of the process, when they're making noise about it, it helps out so much, because then it starts to grab attention and we know what's happening. So I know that this isn't like purely the strictly kind of legal analysis that a lot of folks sometimes like to hear. I find that at this moment sometimes like, okay, we can do that. Or I could say, honestly, plug in deeply to your community. Ask for transparency. The other thing that I would like encourage people to do is ask for like, okay, what is the process? Send me the actual process that you're supposed to go through, because I think that that's another thing that sometimes changes district to district, and follow it throughout. Like if you're interested in those books staying in on the shelves, sometimes that requires not only some work on the part of different community organizations, but also on the part of like folks just like making sure that they're just plugged in. I hope that makes sense and helps out.
It does. Thank you so much. The next question is for Christine. The rise in censorship attempts, book banning, and book challenges is in no way unique to our state. Can you talk about some insight you have from what's happened across the country, and how folks can get involved with your organization to fight back?
Certainly, thank you. Well, as we've been discussing, these efforts to restrict or challenge or even ban books are on the rise, not only in Texas, but throughout the United States. And generally, they target books, graphic novels, and textbooks that address, as we've said before, LGBTQ, sexual content, or race, racism themes. If we look at the American Library Association statistics, in 2021, they reported over 1,500 individual book challenges or removals, and that's up from over 273 in 2020. And I think they also reported in 2019, they received about 566 challenges. So in terms of NCAC, we tracked over 180 incidents in 36 states since 2020. And the majority of these instances have been, for this year, have been over 70. And these tend to be about books with themes that are related to LGBTQ and racial diversity. And like ALL, we've also found that the parents, or in some cases we're looking at public libraries, it's the patrons that are the majority that initiate these types of challenges. And most challenges that take place in the schools or school libraries, and then followed by public libraries. And here, like ALA, we found that the majority of voters and also parents opposed book bans throughout the United States. So they've done survey on that. So as we've said before, these aren't normal in terms of the challenges that we're seeing. Generally, in the past, it's been, challenges emerge when particular titles are introduced and parents or community members object to them. But right now, what we've seen, as we've said before, these are political actions that are organized, and they do target large numbers of classroom as well as library materials. And as Marti has said, these are intentional. They do have political goals, and part of that is to elect specific types of politicians, as we said before, and also secondly, it's to destabilize support for public education is what we found. So in terms of more statistics, we've seen political pressure has played a direct role in book bans, and PEN America reports that in at least 8 districts, they've seen it results in diminished access to students, access to 644 titles. And about 40% of them have a direct tie to political pressure. And in these 8 districts, they highlight Texas, South Carolina, and Georgia. Also, in comparison, if we look at what Education Week reported since January 2021, there's been over 42 states that introduced bills or also have taken steps to restrict teaching on CRT, which is critical race theory, or limit how teachers can discuss racism or sexism in the classroom. And about 17 of them have passed as of the fall 2022. And in terms of what we reported earlier, in terms of the total bans by state, PEN America had reported Texas as a leader with over 713 bans in 16 districts, and numbers have probably changed as of today. So this is just just kind of like the tip of kind of the iceberg in terms of like the beginning of a school year. In terms of what you can do, for us, we do encourage strongly advocacy. As an organization, NCAC, we do not litigate, but we do advise if you're a school staff to either reach out to your teachers union, ACLU, or the Library Association in your state, or the National Council of Teachers of English affiliate that also is local. We do suggest that, for those that are in the public, to attend the school board meetings and sign up to speak in advance. You can also write letters to your school administrators, board members, as well as school officials. And when you place your opinions out there, you kind of show that to the district officials that those that are trying to remove the books are not the majority, and the only ones with strong opinions on these issues. And also you can help support the school officials to help make smart decisions that protect free expression of students. And also you can find on our website and also on other websites that I'll share in the chat, sample letters, for students as well as teachers on, writing to, these district officials. Lastly, you can also contact local media and also write letters to the editor to local publications. So that's one way to do it. In terms of the social media campaigns against book bans, there are quite a bit. There's a hashtag Books Not Bans. There's also hashtag FReadom, which is FREADOM. And there's also the new ALA's Unite Against Book Ban Initiative. And they have a toolkit, so you can find a lot of these, how to write letters, how to write op-eds from their website. They walk you through how to do all of that. So we just encourage you to get involved.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Emeran. A quick follow-up that one of the people who's joined the webinar asked is, where's the best place to sort of track which books have been banned in Texas and around the nation?
I'll field that. The Houston Chronicle actually just released an amazing article series this week. They sent Freedom of Information requests to over 800 districts, and 600 of them responded, and they created a database where you can look up the district, see what books have been removed, see what books have been reviewed, and which ones have been removed. And you can also sort it by topic of the book, so you can see the reasons that the district removed different books. And And this speaks to statistics in general, because we're talking about, last year, ALA counted 1,500 different book removals and titles. Just in Texas alone, one school district removed and reviewed 400 book titles in San Antonio. So the actual numbers are far bigger than what's being reported, because it's relying on people's voluntary reporting. And one thing we can all encourage as different advocacy groups is making sure that every instance of censorship is being reported to ALA's Office of Intellectual Freedom or to PEN America, because they're both counting those. And so that we can try to have at least an accurate assessment of that.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Carolyn. And I will find that and put it in the comments for the folks watching. That sounds like a very good opportunity for parents to look at that. And if they see something that alarms them in their own school district, pick up the phone, talk to your school board trustees, ask them what's going on, because sunshine on these issues is always better. Carolyn, I've actually have a question for you. You've been engaged in critical library advocacy for years. I know I personally remember the banned book display you set up in my high school library. And you recently co-founded Freedom Fighters, a group fighting for intellectual freedom and supporting librarians, students, authors, and teachers in Texas. Can you tell us more about your work and share ways that libraries and educators can get engaged in fighting censorship?
So we are actually a completely voluntary group. We all have other jobs, and we felt passionately that the voices of students and librarians and authors and so on be represented. And our goal is really to be rapid response and to share support and news as things are happening on the ground, because some organizations like ALA aren't maybe geared for that immediate response, because there's so many cases right now going on all over the country. We started out primarily in Texas, and that's our real focus, but we actually get contacted by librarians all over the country now, privately, letting us know what's going on, asking for help or resources. And we have a website with resources about how to explain what librarians do. As someone commented in the Q&A, we need to educate parents, and we also need to educate actually superintendents and school administrators as well, and school board members about how libraries work. Just like people don't understand how football coaching works behind the scenes, they also don't understand necessarily how libraries work behind the scenes. So we also have a page of how to write a letter to a school board, how to speak at a school board meeting, how to write a letter to the editor. We have one from students on how students can get involved. So we tried to create resources that community members can use. And we also have a document on how to actually organize a local advocacy group. I think you were asking how people can get involved and what they can do. So even though the news is statewide and national, ultimately most censorship fights are really local. And so I think one of the most important things listeners can take away from this is it's really important to have local advocacy groups, whether it's an advocacy group around equity and you're interacting with the book censorship piece in your school district, or it's directly about supporting libraries, or it's about student support, or whatever that group is wrapped around. But that local organized advocacy is really important in this moment. And so we do have like a page for a how-to start a group on our website. I do think parent education is really important. And I know one thing I've done, I did a webinar with a former state librarian for a local community, just talking about what libraries do and how we do want to partner with parents. We always have partnered with parents and helping them understand who librarians and teachers really are and what are our processes for selecting books, and just making it really transparent, but doing it not when a conflict's going on, doing it preemptively and just educating people about those processes. And I think that those are two steps I can recommend, and just getting involved, emailing the school board, showing up at a school board meeting, watching your school board meeting from home. Even if you can't go, they're all live streamed now. And so you could just watch it. And during the public comment, if you see something that, you feel like needs to be addressed, then come to the next school board meeting or write your school board members. Because what they hear is what gets the attention. And I also think another thing is keeping students in mind. Students are great advocates for what they need. And we want to make sure that they understand the issues going on, that they have a voice in this. And that actually brings me around to something Donna Howard asked about positive legislation. I think a great positive piece of legislation would be to require that every district either had a student advisory group or a student on their school board, like a student representative that sat in on their school board, so that the students' voices would carry more weight. Because in this moment, what parents have as input into their child's education, of course it matters, but students also are the ones receiving the education, and they have great insights into what is actually going on in their classrooms and libraries. And the last thing I want to remind everybody, which doesn't really answer your question, but it's just, I think it gets forgotten so often in this moment, is that libraries are places of voluntary inquiry. That's what the Supreme Court said in the Pico case. So no one is literally handing a book to a certain child and insisting that they read it. And I think parents can do a lot by how they model when their child ends up with a book they weren't expecting. So I think we all know what happens if there's behavior we want to kind of ignore and just move on. Like, my son asked once about the cashier who was had his arm amputated, and he was wondering where his arm was, and my son was very young. And, so you can have a discussion of that, but if you don't feel prepared to have a discussion of that, I think as parents, we all know how to just turn the page of that book, and we'll have that discussion another time when we're more prepared for it. And so what we model for our kids, if we get alarmed by something, they're going to feel a sense of alarm. And if we handle unexpected surprises and things that our children are reading thoughtfully and without making it a big deal, then our kids aren't going to make it a big deal either. They may not be as curious about the naked character in Where's Waldo as they are trying to look for Waldo on the page. So, we don't know how they're taking something in. So I think as parents, just being really aware of our own responses to things is another way we can help model for our children how we treat other people, how we talk to professionals when we have a problem or a concern. Those are all things that every adult can do.
Thank you for that. And I feel like I just learned from this that at some point, Where's Waldo was the center of a controversy. So those are a series of books I spent a lot of time with as a kid. And I have to say, I don't remember. I engaged in most of that book series, and I have no memories of there being any naked people. So that definitely shows where kids' brains are focused. Is we were busy being angry at that look-alike hat on a different individual. I want to ask you something else, Carolyn. I know because you have this experience as a classroom librarian or school district librarian, can you talk about how y'all go through the process of determining books that make sense in your collections and in which types of schools, and the type of expertise and resources librarians have to make those determinations?
Sure. So there's a number of ways that books are selected for libraries. And the primary way is that librarians read reviews in library journals. So, if if you're in any profession, you know your profession has journals like medical journals and law journals and so on and so forth. And so typically you are reading those magazines full of reviews, and a lot of districts require 2 reviews or 2 reviews, starred reviews that are recommended or so on. And those publications have been around for 50, 60, 70 years that libraries rely on. You also rely on award winner lists because those are vetted. So for a book to be an award winner, like Kyle's book, that means a whole team of people read it. And that whole team probably read 200 books to determine, or 300 books to determine that that book should receive that award. And a group of people read all those books, not just one person making that recommendation. So it's highly vetted at that point. And then we use student recommendations. We get advanced copies from publishers at conferences. So sometimes we have opportunities to read the book before we purchase it. Of course, sometimes we get parental recommendations, or teachers might recommend a book that they've heard about at a conference. And then we also attend webinars with authors. We attend conferences where we hear authors speak about their books, or we get to actually talk to an author in person. We can look at the books at booths at conferences. So there's many different ways we can interact with titles in order to make those determinations. And the book reviews I mentioned have recommended grade levels. And most of the people who write the reviews are librarians or teachers or professional reviewers. And so they're people with experience and have read thousands and thousands of books. And so those are some of the bases we use. And then, of course, the curriculum in our own school. Like a school might have a really strong, like our school had a really strong art program. So we had a big art collection in our library, whereas another school might have an auto mechanic shop or a STEM program, and they may have a lot of STEM books. So you really are tailoring it a little bit, but then also keeping an eye to diversity, because as you all spoke about, having windows into other people's experiences. So you want to make sure in this global workplace, right? I think one of the things that's getting lost here is our students are not just going to stay in Texas when they get a job. And even if they do, they may be working over Zoom with people all over the world. And our kids aren't just going to stay in Muleshoe or, Sci-Fair. They're going to be working all over the world. And so many of them are college bound. How are we preparing them for our future if we're screening off whole areas of knowledge and saying, by high school, they can't handle this topic? Then we're sending them into an environment where they're working with all people. And they need to be able to work in the workplace and have empathy for their coworkers. And so your book collection can't just strictly reflect the diversity in your own community. You have to be preparing students for that global work environment that they'll be entering.
Thank you for that. I know as a legislator in the state of Texas, we're expected to deal with issues just across the gamut, and no one person can be an expert on everything. So I think one of the critical things is that we keep remembering there are people with expertise, and we lean on those folks. And I think we all know that folks like doctors and engineers and whatnot are experts, but we also have to remember our educators are experts, and our librarians are bringing a wealth of knowledge and resources backing up these selections. So I want to sort of just ask everyone, how can people like librarians, educators, authors, people caught in this crossfire support each other against all of these attempts at censorship and book challenges? I'll open that up to everyone.
Well, to speak again, I think one thing we're trying to do is offer hope and support to not only librarians and students, but to authors as well. And, we've had we had events last year like Freedom Fridays, where we would celebrate diverse books and ask people to share what they were reading, highlight the book cover, and give the author props for, you know, an engaging title. And because I think there's a lot of people need support in this. The students that are showing up at school board meetings need our support because they feel disenfranchised. The librarians who are being harassed on social media and being called pedophiles for providing materials to a diverse array of students, they need support. But the authors who have poured their heart and soul into their books, and books that are sometimes accounts of their own lives, need to know that readers care about their books too. So that's my feedback.
Thank you. You know, one thing I've noticed as an elected official is the folks who would like to see less diversity of books on our shelves are quite organized and send me lots of very structured emails, often very similar emails. And I know that elected officials, you know, whether at the local level or at the state level, sometimes need to be able to show up and say, look, my community is not supportive of this ban. What tips do y'all have for helping folks get engaged on staying in touch with their local officials and offering them support in standing up to this censorship, especially with our school board members?
Something that I've been saying for quite a long time now. I know that some of my colleagues on this panel can't say the same thing given the nature of your work or whatever, but I can say because I don't have a job. So I know that there is often this very well-meaning impulse to use sort of all-encompassing language, like all people matter, all stories matter, all voices deserve to be heard. And I think that if you are firmly committed to that, then you are also then supporting the people who are calling me a pedophile. And you are also making space for books that, you know, call for like genocide of my community and other communities. And I think that it is an understandable impulse, but I've been working on being more specific in my language and saying, I believe that trans people deserve to be alive. I believe that Black history is important and that white supremacist understandings of history should not be taught. And I think that it's, you know, it's hard to just say like, find your moral compass and stick to it. But I think that that is sort of a fundamental step to doing this kind of work, is identifying like, what do you believe in and what are you willing to do to stand by it instead of hiding behind the language of like everyone or all, because the people who believe that I should not be allowed to like write my books or live certainly don't use that same kind of language. They are clear and specific and precise about what they want. And I believe that we should be as well.
I'll just say as a quick follow-up to that, because that was spot on. I just like want to encourage people to stay plugged in, because I think that for the most part, at least I saw amongst the people that I'm close to, that when we started to see and hear about book removals, we became like acutely aware of what was happening, because we kind of understood like, what does this mean? It means like erasure. It means like removal from the public space in more ways than one. And so the biggest thing that I can think about, in addition to what Kyle was saying, which is being really specific, because it is actually important to be really specific in terms of like who and what type of work is being targeted, who is being targeted, who is being asked to leave these spaces. But in addition to that, it's just like showing up, right? I think the thing that's necessary is just like, you know, I joke around, but I'm very serious. I tell people all the time, I'm like, read banned books, like banned books with the, you know, of course, like there are specific banned books that I would say to read, but you know, for the books that like were banned, that I found out were banned and are being banned now or trying to be removed, those are the books that I find to be so necessary and so critical at this moment, when we're seeing all the ways in which our very diverse society is kind of it's at a point of like deep like friction. And I think that the only way forward is for us to just be honest and truthful about where we're at, and like this diversity is not leaving, so your attempts to remove these books will not do anything more than just create another barrier to, you know, students and other folks who will find these books in another way. So I just want to encourage people to stay plugged in, to make resources available, to also meet the immediate needs of students who want to access these materials. I've been seeing really amazing work, not only from, you know, librarians and teachers, but also just like from other like public libraries who are just like, so we're just going to digitize our catalogs. So yeah, I encourage people to just make this information available to folks, because I think it's so incredibly unfair to remove students from the public space, and you do that every time you take a book away.
I know a student that we've been working with, and Katie, who just graduated, Cameron Samuels, was he and some friends organized a book giveaway of banned books across their district, and had like 5 different book giveaways. So there's things like that that you can do just to improve the access in a community where a lot of things are being removed. I think, you know, for me, the largest question around this, and sort of legislatively even, is that this is really ultimately about our democracy. So our founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin founded the first library. The Library of Congress was Thomas Jefferson's book collection that he donated to become, which ultimately became the Library of Congress, the biggest library in the world. And so it's one of our founding principles as a country that we allow access to ideas, and that libraries are places where different ideas can exist, and different people's stories can exist. And I appreciate what you were saying, Kyle, and I want to do better in regards to what you were saying and being specific about it. And then on the broader scale, I just think we need to understand that this is a very slippery slope. So when, you know, this initial list came out in Texas from the representative, it had 850 titles on it. And of course, they were predominantly about race and LGBTQ characters, and also about sexual abuse and abortion, but also random things are on this list. So we need to have intellectual rigor when we look at a list like that and examine it and understand, you know, where did this come from? What was the motivation? And that's on educators and educational institutions to really take a critical eye to something like that. But I think it's also important that we consider the slippery slope, where now we're having books about seahorses in North Carolina be put on a list to be restricted, and mouse, and now Diary of Anne Frank. And in Keller today, they had district librarians pull every book that was already reviewed off the shelf, that was already reviewed and allowed to remain in the library last year, pulled off the shelf. And that included the Bible and the Diary of Anne Frank. So where does it stop? And I think that's the question every citizen of this country should be asking, is where does this stop? And understanding that part of a democracy is free access to ideas and freedom of speech and the First Amendment.
Yeah, thank you all for that. I'll add one thing, just real specific, building off Avatara, is support the authors of these books. There's sort of this idea that being banned is like good for authors and their books sell more copies, but that's only true for like a very small number of really high profile cases. And quite frankly, it's usually not true for the books of people who have marginalized identities. That's usually something that, you know, happens to books by straight white people for them to actually get more attention from being banned. Usually the books by LGBTQ folks or by people of color who end up banned do not get any benefit. So do support those authors directly, and support them because that's good and helps there continue to be demand for those books, helps them to continue to be successful in publishing world, but also because it's so informative to pick up these books and see what it is people are actually attacking. You know, I purchased Genderqueer recently, a graphic novel about somebody who's non-binary, and sort of going through the process of understanding their identity. And it was wild to me that this book that has that really was about somebody partially acknowledging they don't have a lot of sexual desire, was attacked as being hypersexualized, and really was just about and going through this process of asking questions about who they were, which you could see being such a valuable book for a young person who had similar questions themselves. You know, how do I feel about this? How do I feel about that? And it literally this process of a person asking questions to better understand themselves, and better know how to explain themselves to others. And so it's a really informative process for folks to go through to see what books are being attacked and why, because the idea that these books are being attacked solely because they have sexual content is a blatant lie. And if you don't believe me, pick up And Tango Makes Three, which is a book that's been targeted that is about two very cute male penguins who adopt an egg, that people have gone after. That's the level of absurdity. I want to sort of build on a little bit what you just said, Carolyn, about Keller ISD pulling all these books, and we had a question about this as well. That, you know, we had this past of people making decisions locally about these issues, that has become hyper partisanized. That we've seen state folks go after, and sort of how do we re-empower districts to actually stick to their local processes, and what can folks do if their district has started throwing that process out the window?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges right now is that districts aren't necessarily following their own policies. Like I looked up Keller. I know they've been in the process of getting rid of their old policy and adopting the new one. So I'm not sure what's on the website is the new or the old one, but you know, nowhere in their policy does it say you can just go in and remove 40 books from the shelf because someone says so. So it's a real challenge. So I'd love to hear from the experts here on what recourse people do have.
I mean, I'll just follow up quickly and say, like, this is when I would encourage people to like pay attention to what's happening and to try to be as aware as possible in terms of like what is the process that you're being told is happening versus what is actually happening in that district, because it's very important. I sometimes tell folks, the people who come to me with like the most like the beautiful timelines, I'm just like, oh wow, you really have been like looking. But it's critically important for a couple of reasons, just, you know, because when we don't have a clear understanding of like, okay, what books are being removed? How is this process actually holding up to like the standards that have been set out, or how are they deviating from the process? It's then hard to like, you know, kind of tell like what should be expected. So that's kind of like my biggest starting point for most folks. And I feel it's the most tangible and kind of sometimes the easiest. And it can be done by, you know, students in terms of, you know, asking the questions like, hey, what's the process when that book gets removed? Why was the book removed? How can I, if it's, you know, especially if it's a book that you want to see back, how can I move to have the book added back? Like what, again, just asking the questions, you know, asking for, again, anything possible to understand what is that process, and just checking to see like, is it deviating from the process that's laid out? And then of course, and I'll make sure to follow up, but if there are ever any questions, feel free to reach out to Lambda Legal. We have an amazing help desk that's staffed by actual attorneys, and we always want to make sure that you know, as much as possible, we can provide support when necessary and when needed.
I think you're muted, Erin.
Have to do it once a Zoom. Thank you so much, Avatara. So we are nearing the end of our time. So I want to invite all of our panelists to share any closing thoughts, either about, anything you haven't covered yet, and in particular, any other tips for folks to get engaged in the process.
I'll start. I just want to say and remind folks that your local officials, your school board members, your city council members who, regulate policy for the city libraries, sometimes that's a county commissioner, but your local officials are extremely accessible. Like they literally live in your neighborhood, or, like you can connect to those folks. And something that, we at TFN want to be able to do is to connect you with the information and the resources to be able to go to those folks and help educate them on these issues and they can help get questions answered. Like if you're looking for what is the actual policy for how the school district is supposed to, pull books, that might not be something that they're focused on, because they also are like trying to balance a budget and like do 100 other things. But if you're there and you have that relationship and you ask those questions, they might explore that with you. So those relationships are really important to try to create. And then, it's really like you and 5 of your friends who care about this issue could make a difference. You can collect people, you can advocate. And for those officials to know that you've got their back and that you will help get them information, you will help bring people to the table, you will help bring people to the meeting. That is a huge role that one individual can play. And so if you are interested in that, I know several of the organizations on here have also addressed that their organizations have resources. We would love to connect with you and give you the resources, give you the tools, do the trainings with you to help you feel comfortable being able to go and be advocates in your community. So thanks, y'all.
Thank you, Marti. And I want to affirm 5 people contacting a school board member on the same issue is loud. 20 people is screaming. Very small groups of people communicating consistently and persistently is incredibly effective. You know what, I'm going to call on Kyle to wrap up so that we can get out of the awkward who's going to unmute next.
Oh, I was actually thinking about what I wanted to say. And I don't think I have anything last to say about myself. I just want to say that I've done a lot of events like this, unfortunately or fortunately. And so far, this is the one with the most on the ground actionable steps. And I'm very impressed with what all of you are doing. And I feel better knowing that this work is in your hands.
Thank you, Kyle. That's very kind. And thank you for your books and for your advocacy. Carolyn.
So as an actionable summary, I also just encourage you to reach out to when you hear a story about a librarian being harassed, send them a note. When you check in on your librarians in your public library and your school district, even if they aren't personally experiencing anything right now, they're still worried about it and they need that support. And the same with authors. If you hear of something about an author's book, buy their book, send them an appreciative tweet about their work. And I also want to call out Texans Right to Read, which is an organization that TLA, Texas Library Association, started. And it's an advocacy group that is working to highlight these issues in libraries as well. And anyone can join and be part of the coalition, along with ALA's Unite Against Book Bans, which is a national coalition of all sorts of people coming together to fight these issues. And the last thing I want to leave everyone with is, so I was a librarian for 29 years, and in 29 years, we had 3 book challenges. The rate of book challenges right now is unprecedented, and everyone involved, I think, including legislators, politicians, need to take a step back and remember, what were libraries like when they walked into them? What was their public library like? What was their school library like? Did they see books on special shelves and have to sign parental permission notes to check out a library? I mean, many legislators are in their 50s, 60s, 70s. Did they ever experience that? And our students are much more worldly now than they were in 1950. So just remembering the libraries of their youth, and why don't the children of today deserve that same kind of access in their libraries. And then I also want to remind everyone that librarians want to partner with families. We are not, there's been an attempt to divide educators from families. We are partners in education, and we want to work together for what's best for each child, but each child is different and we can't make a decision for everyone. Thanks.
Thank you, Carolyn. And Rep. Howard used the question feature to tell us that she never experienced that in her days in libraries. Dr. Emeran.
Thank you. Just to be brief, I just want to thank everyone for the opportunity to talk to you about, what is going on. I felt it was a really productive to be able to share some of my knowledge, and also to learn from, the panelists on what they're experiencing on the ground. So what I would advise for those that are listening, if they do encounter an incident, to report it. As Carolyn has said, ALA, NCAC, we investigate these cases. We mobilize our resources to write advocacy letters in support of these particular books. So, keep us informed, if you learn, because as the statistics, tell us, much of this type of censorship goes unreported. So we have a huge undercount. So it is essential, when you do learn about something that's happening in your community, to reach out to one of our partner organizations, ourselves included, and just to shed light on what is going on in these communities. And we are connected. All these organizations are connected together to be able to provide the right resources, whether it's legal or support to particular communities. That's one thing that I would encourage, people to do. And also for those that are in schools, to know the policies. I think that's really important for when these challenges occur, to be able to see, if districts are following, procedures in a, transparent way. If not, that's usually an opening for advocacy in terms of, putting pressure on, these schools to follow the rules, and to allow access to these books. So I think this has been really important to shed that light. And so I'd like to, to end there, and thank you, Representative Zwiener, for including me.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, Avatara.
I mean, I truly have nothing to add. I think the only thing I can say is, make books accessible. My sister had a birthday recently. She's a couple years younger than me, and her request to all of her friends was to bring a book. And she collected books from her friends and dropped it off at a community event, so that way some of the kids could have books. We grew up with books in our household. We understand the importance of having access to literature that actually reflects us, and not only us, but also our community. So I'm just going to leave off on that. I think that everyone should have access to the books that they need, and the books that tell you about, the world that you live in. So, yep, that's it.
Thank you so much. I'm really grateful to all of our panelists tonight. Really grateful to our event partners, the National Coalition Against Censorship, Texas Freedom Network, Equality Texas, and FReadom. I have to tell you, I love that name, FReadom. I'm always down for a good pun. And I just want to encourage everyone to stay engaged in these conversations, as was discussed a little bit during this event, particularly if you are in a suburban or exurban district. That's where we're seeing a lot of these attacks concentrated. So particularly if you're in those areas, please, please, please pay attention to what is going on in your school district, and stay engaged with your community, with your school board, with your state representative. Your voice absolutely matters and can make a big difference in these conversations. So thank y'all so much for joining tonight. And I hope you finish your evening with a great book, preferably one that somebody's trying to ban. And thank you for being with us in this fight. Have a good night, y'all.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.